can.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Hello, everybody. Father Moss back again. We're going to finish up the Catholic Church in Wales, and it's going to finish up just like the one in England, the Reformation, and how much damage the Reformation did to Catholicism. And but anyway, when I started talking about, we're talking about the Romans, and that's where Christianity came into. See, the Romans went to the island of 43 AD, and they left 410. So they were there for a little over 300 years, but they got pulled out of British Isles because the barbarians were sacking Rome, because Rome was sacked in 410 as well. That's when they were pulled out. And so, but many of them were Christians, and they passed Christianity on to the Celtic people, also known as the Britons. So the Romano Britons were Christians. And then after the Romans left, the question always was there a vacuum of leadership? Was there the beginning of the Dark Ages? And it turns out the ages were not dark. As a matter of fact, the phrase Dark Ages is totally inadequate. And that was actually attributed to the Renaissance, when they tried to claim everything before the Renaissance was a time of darkness and ignorance and superstition. No, not true at all. A lot of progress, a lot of inventions, a lot of wonderful things were achieved in those Middle Ages before the Renaissance. So, but anyway, we know that I just saw on YouTube, some, is YouTube a good source of information? Well, maybe. You have to be careful. But they did pollen samples from area near Hadrian's Wall. And although the Romans were stationed throughout Britain and Wales, they had things called Kai Went and Kai Leon. Kai Leon were two towns established by the Romans in South Wales. So they were places other than up by Hadrian's Wall. And but anyway, they did the pollen samples and found that there was not a change in grain pollen. They continued to plant crops of wheat and so forth after the Romans left. And there was not an increase in arboreal pollen, that is, trees. This is what happens when you stop cultivating the land. Then the trees come back again. And so you can tell whether the farming stopped in those years. And it didn't. As a matter of fact, it increased. So the Romano Britons actually took up everything that the Romans were doing and improved on it. And one of the things that they did was they used a lot of Latin in their language. There are about 600 words of Latin in Welsh, but their Latin is the purest spoken Latin, because you see, Latin in the European countries are Romantic languages, and the Celts or the Welsh are Celts, and so it's not a Latin base. So there's not a confusion of the two languages, as in French or Italian or Spanish or any of those languages. They're closely related to Latin. And the monks then copied a lot of Welsh history and writings and so forth. And so they made a lot of manuscripts. Now, the reason we know a lot about these people is that St. Gildas was a monk who wrote a huge tome, and I'll try it's the Exedio and Conquesto Britanniae, is the name of it. And it was a whole history of these people. And so he lived in the 600s. So it's sort of like Venerable Bede, who wrote after the fact too. Venerable Bede was on the east coast of the British Isles. So he wrote a lot about Anglo-Saxons and such. But we also know from Tacitus, like the Roman war against the Druids, they actually killed off the Druids, so that opened the door for Christianity to flourish. And so Romans brought Christianity, and then they also enabled the spread of Christianity because they had decimated the Druids. And the Druids were a very aggressive priesthood that practiced human sacrifice. And so, and they decimated them on the island Britannia Sea. Britain Sea was an island that they decimated them. But anyway, then there was this story. Remember I talked about Boudica? Boudica was a woman warrior. See, the Celts women were tough women, you know. They were a matrilineal culture. That is, women were in charge. And you find that, I know that from my own family, like the Irish and the ancestors, women have a lot stronger role in those societies. And my grandmother was very closely associated with Attila the Hun. She is very opinionated, for an Irish lady. But anyway, so Boudica was a warrior, and I wanted to look it up, but I didn't for this. This is my last Welsh talk. Boudica lost that war with the Normans. The general's name was Suetonius, and we know a lot about that because Tacitus wrote about it. You know Tacitus? Tacitus is a Roman historian, but Tacitus' father-in-law was in the legion that fought the war against Boudica. And so that was the end of her because she escaped the battle, but she committed suicide rather than taking captive. If you're a woman in those days, you just didn't want to be taken captive. But she was a great figure, actually, a very strong leader, a very smart leader. So she needs to get a lot of credit. And then if you go to Wales, there are various statues to Boudica as well. So on the Romans, to finish up the Romans, they had trade. I found out more. I said it was the Mediterranean, but more specifically it was with Byzantium. And they did samples. They take the clay and slice it very thin, and then they what they did is look at it through the microscope, and they were able to identify the source of the clay for the jars that brought the wine and the olive oil around the west coast of Europe up to England. And but why would they bring it? Well, it was an exchange because, as you know, Cornwall and also Devon was the source of a lot of tin. And tin was a sought-after commodity. So they unloaded all of their amphora or jars of olive oil and such, and then took on loads of tin, which is, of course, as you know, tin with copper becomes bronze. And so they needed that. And England was at one time called the Tin Isle because they had such a rich resource of tin there. But it's mostly in Cornwall and Devon, which is a county next to Cornwall. So, as a matter of fact, Cornish miners went all over the world because they were very good at working underground in these tin mines. That in the United States, they came and they worked in the mines as well, mostly coal miners. So what I want to talk about now is the coming of the Normans And the Normans leadership was very, very supportive of the church. And they're the ones who, now there were monks, like Saint David is the patron saint of Wales. Saint David was a monk, and there's a cathedral in South Wales called Saint David's Cathedral. And so they had monks, but it was the Normans who brought in the Benedictines and the Cistercians. Cistercians are Benedictines of a stricter observance. And they built monasteries, particularly in Wales. The monasteries has more than 100 monks in each one of them, and there were a lot of monasteries. But they were wonderful pastoralists. They had tens of thousands of sheep, which they raised and sold the wool. There was a good market for wool in those days, and the money they used to support the population. They ran organizations for schools to educate the young. They also had supported the poor with alms. They had hospitals. They had old age homes. But they also did a lot of work in educating people because monks usually develop a lot of agriculture activities. They become very good at it, and they pass that knowledge on to the Welsh people. So they were very good for the economy. And so the people just loved the monks. And if you remember when I was talking about England and the Normans, Matilda, not to be confused with Melissa, Matilda was the daughter of Henry I, and she was the one who fought for the throne, fought against Stephen, but it ended up a standoff where she allowed Stephen to take the throne, but he lasted only a very short period of time. And then her son, Henry II, became the king of England, but he was a different family as opposed to the Normans. They were the Plantagenets, and they were a very ruthless group, but they lasted for 300 years. So Matilda financed a lot of the Cistercian monks, and they did great work for. There's an author much later, author by the name of Gerard of Wales, who wrote a history of the church in Wales. And it was really wonderful with the monks and with the church working with the people. So the people really loved their church and identified with it. And the reason I bring that up is the Reformation that's coming. And people say, well, you know, the Reformation had to take place because the church was corrupt and all these things, which is a bunch of baloney. Because especially in England and especially in Wales, the church was really magnificent and did great things for the people. And also there was hardly a shred of scandal connected with it because we're talking the monks, you know. That's a little different. Now, there have been stories of monks in history, but Cistercian monks didn't cause scandals a whole lot, if at all. There might have been one or two, but I don't know about this, you know. I don't want to say, 100%. But the Reformation begins with, as we went over with Henry VIII, and just to show how brutal, I'm not going to go over that again, but Henry VIII was so brutal, he cared nothing about human life whatsoever, and would execute. He executed the right and left all throughout the island. Anybody who he thought crossed him, off with their heads, except not off with their heads. If it could be shown to be treason, it was hung, drawn, and quartered, which is a terrible way to go, which is really savage, you know. But just to show how ruthless he was, Bishop Fisher, do you remember when I talked about John Fisher, what a holy and learned priest he was? Well, the Vatican named him as a cardinal, and then Henry VIII got the news that Bishop had been elevated to the cardinal rank, and he was reported to say, well, he might receive a red hat, but he won't have a head to put it on. That's pretty heartless, you know. So, but he hated Rome at that point. And so that's what was going on. And then, as you know, it got worse under Elizabeth, who was even more ruthless and cruel. And then her son, Edward VI, is the one who ordered that anything that was smacked of Catholicism was to be smashed. As the Welsh people who had all these wonderful statues and vessels and things like that, donated by their families and contributed by their families, were all destroyed. You know, the people were gathered around to see this being done. So there were some respites. Mary Tudor was queen for a while. She was Catholic and tried to restore the church, but she was only on the throne for 5 years. And as soon as she died, then Elizabeth became the queen, and she sought to restore Protestantism. And I have to say, the Protestants were just totally dishonest. Their lawyers made up laws right and left. Victims were given trials, but they were all sham trials, because when Henry said they're going to die, they're going to die. And so, you know, it was only going through the paces to make it look legal, and so it's really terrible. But in Wales, there were recusants. There are those of the recusare is those who refuse, and they initially under Elizabeth had to pay a small fine for them because they had wardens that went and counted everybody and made sure they went to the state church, which is Church of England. And if they didn't show up, they got a fine. But those penalties increased. Well, they didn't entirely in Wales, especially South Wales, because they had wealthy, noble families that with a lot of power, like the Somerset family, who protected them. And they would have these justices of the peace, in terms of being reported for missing services, but they were all Catholics. And so it went lightly on them. But that was kind of a curse in a way, because the Welsh had ways to keep the British at bay, but eventually those things broke down. And because they had been more faithful and protested louder, then the British and Protestant forces were more brutal to them. To the extent that in Cornwall, to this day, hardly any Catholics left. 9% of the population is Catholic now, and which is more than in England. I mean less than in England, because they were so terrified of what the English would do to them if they did turn Protestant. And in Wales, it was 10%. So now, and of course, there's a smaller population too. So there are in England, it's about more than 10%, but it still adds up to several million. I think it's 6 million Catholics in England, and growing because of immigration. But basically, what the Reformation did in England, we want to talk about Catholicism in England, is that it was pretty much destroyed and has a hard time because it was ground zero. They had to start from ground zero because they were so thorough and so brutal in stamping off Catholicism, and they're so radical. For example, Edward VI he was a boy king, and though he wrote those laws when he was just beginning to be a teenager, and then he died suddenly. But he was very, very anti-Catholic because all of his regents, all of his advisors were Protestants, and they poisoned his mind against Catholicism. And so, generally speaking, in England, yeah, in England, they have still a negative attitude. And of course, that was transported to the United States. And so there's been a lot of anti-Catholicism around. We're getting over it eventually, but there's still pockets of it, and there's still attitudes that still prevail. And that's the same in England. And so I have a hard time getting enthusiastic, and that's on my personal point of view, enthusiastic about the crown. I know that Queen Elizabeth has been a very dignified queen and so forth, but she's still the inheritor of all that stuff. She's still the head of the Church of England, the state church, and I don't hear a whole lot of apologies for the terrible things that were done to Catholics. And there were times, during the Reformation where they were so virulently murderous. They have people like Oliver Cromwell. Have you ever heard of him? He went to Ireland and murdered 600,000 Irish. And that was that's what we've heard of the Irish Troubles. People still remember that, when you go in and just slaughter people right and left. So Cromwell was not a nice person, but he's a big shot in English history, And so I like the Queen Elizabeth, but you reign over a system that is very anti-Catholic, and you don't seem to be aware of it. And I just can't wait until Charles becomes king. We'll see what happens there. Oh, good luck. So, but anyway, so there we have it. I'm going to end this then because we're done with Wales. I'm thinking about, but let me know what you think. I'm thinking about Bill Donahue, who's written a book about abuse and crisis, and it's a wonderful book, and I'm reading it, and I thought I might just pass that on by video because we find out that the abuse scandal is over. The Catholic Church did a wonderful job of ending it, and but we don't get any credit for it because there are many people in high places that want that scandal to stay around forever because they have much to gain, especially people who are in favor of like-sex marriages and abortion. They want the church to have a bad name, so they can say, "Who are you to tell us what's moral, what's not?" You see. But that's been fixed. As a matter of fact, Donahue has recommended that other organizations, and there's a long list of Protestant churches, Jews, Muslims, doctors, public schools, who have a much worse record than the Catholic Church does. But the press never reported any of that because they wanted to target the Catholic Church and bring it down. So I'd like to talk about that. I won't talk forever and ever, as far as I can restrain myself. But I told you about Henri Hilaire Belloc, who wrote Cautionary Tales. And so I'd like to read about Jim, and that'll finish it up, okay? So Jim, there was a boy whose name was Jim. His friends were very good to him. They gave him tea and cakes and jam and slices of delicious ham. They chopped it with pink inside and little tricycles to ride, and read him stories through and through, and even took him to the zoo. But there it was the dreadful fate befell him, which I now relate. At least you ought to know, for I have often told you so, that children never are allowed to leave their nurses in a crowd. Now this was Jim's special foible. He ran away when he was able. And on this inauspicious day, he slipped his hand and ran away, and hadn't gone a yard when, bang, with open jaws a lion sprang and hungrily began to eat the bull, beginning with his feet. Now just imagine how it feels when first your toes and then your heels and then with gradual degrees, your shins and ankles and calves and knees, and slowly you can bit by bit. It's wonderful. And so, no wonder Jim detested him. No wonder he shouted, "Ho!" And the honest keeper heard the cry, though very fast. He almost ran to help the little gentleman. "Pronto!" he ordered as he came, for Pronto was the lion's name. "Pronto!" he cried, with an angry frown. "Let go, sir! Down, sir! Put it down!" The lion made a sudden stop and let the dainty morsel drop, and slunk reluctant to his cage, snarling with disappointed rage. Now when he bent over him, the honest keeper's eyes were dim. The lion had reached his head. The miserable boy was dead. But when nurse informed his parents, they were more concerned than I can say. His mother, as she dried her eyes, said, "Well, it gives me no surprise. He would not do what he was told." And his father, who was self-controlled, made all children round at Jim, to Jim's miserable end, and always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse. It's been a wonderful story. And they tell me kids like stories like that. You know. So you'll think twice about hanging on to the nurse. Anyway, I just really enjoy this. We want to, we're out of time, aren't we?
We get 3.5 minutes.
Henry King. This is short. The chief defect of Henry King was trimming little bits of string. At last he swallowed some, which tied itself into ugly knots inside. Physicians and the utmost pain were called at once, but when they came, they answered as they took their fees, "There is no cure for this disease, and it will soon be dead." His parents stood about his bed, lamenting his untimely death, when Henry, with his last breath, cried, "Oh, my friend, be warned by me that breakfast, dinner, lunch, and tea are all the human frame requires. With that, the wretched child expires." I did love these stories. They were very popular in England. But for a nation that went through all these brutal just killings and everything, they have a taste for that sort of thing. So okay, thanks for being with us. I ran out of material, and you're probably thinking, "Oh, thank God he's done." So I'm going to talk about what Bill Donahue wrote in his latest book, because I think it's very interesting and people should know. Bye now. Thanks for listening.